Chapter 11. Fire and Exile. The Fall of Jerusalem. In 586 BC, Babylon came for the city. The siege had lasted over a year. Food was gone, water was scarce, disease had set in. Inside Jerusalem's walls, people clawed at hope while watching their world unravel. Then the walls broke, the soldiers flooded in, and Jerusalem burned. A city in ashes. The Babylonians showed no mercy. They slaughtered the defenders. They tore down the city walls. They looted the temple, stripped the gold, and broke the holy objects. They marched the priests and officials into exile or killed them. They blinded the last king of Judah, Zedekiah, and dragged him to Babylon. The temple centerpiece of Josiah's reform in the heart of national worship was reduced to rubble and ash. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a collapse of meaning. In the theology of Deuteronomy, covenant obedience brings security. The temple was supposed to be the place God chose. Jerusalem was the city of the king God anointed. So why did it fall? When the system breaks, Josiah had died trying to hold the covenant together. His sons failed him. The kings who followed either submitted or rebelled, always under pressure, always under watch. By the time Babylon came, Judah was fractured and weak politically. The fall made sense, but the religious cost was harder to measure. The temple was not just a building. It was a symbol of divine presence. Its destruction was a crisis deeper than war. It raised terrifying questions. Was Yahweh defeated? Was the covenant a lie? Had God abandoned the people? This wasn't just physical exile. It was spiritual collapse, lamentation as survival. In the ruins, a new voice began to speak, not of triumph, not of purity, but of grief. The book of Lamentations captures the moment. How deserted lies the city once so full of people. Her children have gone into exile, captive before the foe. Lamentations 1:1-5. This wasn't law or prophecy. It was poetry written in trauma. Other texts joined the chorus. Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept. Ezekiel's visions of God leaving the temple. Jeremiah's words of warning, mourning, and slow reconstruction. These voices didn't pretend everything was fine. They didn't explain the loss away. They named it. And that naming became theology, memory reframed. The exile forced a total rethinking of the story. If the temple could fall, if the king could be humiliated, if the land could be lost, then faith had to move somewhere else. The old model had said, one land, one king, one altar, one God. Now the land was foreign, the king was gone, the altar was rubble. Only the God remained. The people began to tell their history differently. They gathered stories, laws, and legends, some old, some newly shaped. They began to write not for kings, but for survivors. The rise of textual faith. Before the exile, written texts were rare, elite, often kept in temple spaces and under priestly control. After the fall, text became a lifeline. With the temple destroyed and sacrifices impossible, the scrolls became sacred space, law became memory, stories became survival. Deuteronomy was copied, edited, and taught as the heart of identity. Genesis through Kings began to form as a national story of failure and hope. Prophetic books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, not just as records, but as warnings and maps for a return. This wasn't history as fact, it was history as meaning-making. The exile made writing a form of resistance, a way to say, we are still here. A God who goes into exile. One of the most radical ideas to emerge after the fall was this. God didn't stay in Jerusalem. In Ezekiel, the prophet sees a vision of Yahweh's presence leaving the temple before the destruction in Babylon. Ezekiel receives new visions, God's voice still active, even in exile. This was new. In ancient religion, gods were tied to places. If your city fell, your God was considered defeated. But here, Israel's God moved, not just across borders, but across frameworks. This reshaped how God was understood, not just as a territorial deity, but as something unbound by geography or empire. That's how a shattered people began to reclaim their faith, not by rebuilding the system, but by reimagining it. Trauma turned into text. The exile created space for reflection with teeth. Writers didn't simply say, we messed up. They wrestled with what went wrong and why. Some doubled down on the covenant logic. We sinned, so we lost. Others pushed further, suggesting that the people's history needed to be told from the ground up, not just the throne down. That's how you get a Bible made in fragments. Kings blames disobedience. Lamentations just weeps. Jeremiah speaks of a future, but mourns the present. Ezekiel sees hope in exile, but only after watching the system fall apart. Genesis and Exodus, reshaped in exile, offer a narrative of beginnings, slavery, deliverance, and law-giving in the wilderness, stories that mirrored the exile itself. Exile didn't just create new theology, it shaped the entire biblical imagination. No temple, no king, no map. In 586 BCE, Jerusalem didn't just fall, the whole system of belief collapsed. The king was in chains, the temple was ash, the covenant had failed, the people were scattered, and the world no longer made sense. But in the ashes, something began to form. Not a new kingdom, not a new building, but a new kind of identity. Based in story, rooted in law, carried by memory, flexible enough to move without a palace, that shift would define Judaism after exile. It would also influence Christianity and Islam, which both inherited the idea that texts can hold what buildings lose, a people in motion. The exile turned Israelites into Jews, a people no longer defined by land or kingship, but by survival, covenant, and memory. Babylon tried to erase them, it failed. They didn't keep power, they kept story. The scrolls became portable sanctuaries. The rituals adapted, the identity deepened, and a new kind of strength emerged, not in armies, but in the ability to remember, revise, and resist through writing. What the fall taught. The fall of Jerusalem didn't just end a kingdom. It exposed the limits of theology tied too tightly to place, to power, to system. Faith that survives fire must be able to move, and so the story moved. From altar to scroll, from king to scribe, from land to law, from certainty to resilient memory. The Bible that would emerge was not written in peace or power. It was forged in crisis, in exile, by people who lost everything, except the will to tell the story again.